Hello, everyone. Today's learning target is to explain the status of the early colonies in North America leading up to the Revolution. Basically, we're going to set the stage for the colonies to get really, really angry at Great Britain and have a full-blown revolution. So we got to get there first. All right, so let's take a look at how the colonies were in around 1750. By now, the British colonies had been settled pretty well. Remember, the explorers came and claimed their land, and then more and more people came from Europe and settled the colonies there. But what this actually means is that the Native Americans have been pushed off of their territory now for some time. And now we've got the European colonies or the British colonies pretty well established by the year 1750. There were about 1 million colonists living in the colonies at this point, and that was up from 50,000 100 years before that. So the population has really been booming in the British colonies. Each colony was self-governed. Now, what that means is they elected their own officials to an assembly to make their own decisions for themselves. They made their own laws for themselves. They created their own taxes for themselves, and they spent their own taxes on themselves as well. So they got to make their own taxes and spend their own taxes on themselves. So Virginia got to control Virginia, and North Carolina got to control North Carolina, and Massachusetts got to control Massachusetts, and they were all in charge of themselves. They belonged to England, but they were independent. They were each just doing their own thing as their own unique colony. So pause here now and describe how the early colonies basically were in your own words. Now we're getting on to the French and Indian Wars. Like I said, we've got to have war. And what causes war? Usually other wars. So let's take a look at what happened here. Remember that England wasn't the only European country that was fighting for land or claiming land on North America. The French were, and so were the Spanish, right? France and Spain were both claiming land on North America. All of those countries basically taking land away from the indigenous people who were already here. But in this case, we're now fighting for land between Britain and France. And so this orange land over here, that's the land that was claimed by England or Great Britain. That includes the 13 colonies that were here, right? The green land is the land that the French were claiming on North America. And this kind of stripy land that says ceded, we'll get to that word in a second, that's the land that the British and the French were fighting over. They each were claiming that land at the same time. So for this war, some of the Indians or Native Americans allied with the French, while others allied with the British. And that's why it's called the French and Indian Wars. Can be a little confusing because we would think, oh, the French and Indian Wars must be the French fighting the Indians. No, no, no. It was actually the British fighting against the French and the Indians, but also fighting with the Indians on their own side. Now, I also want to point out here that the name itself, French and Indian Wars, is perhaps outdated. That word Indian, we know better that a more proper term would be Native American or indigenous people. But this is still what the name of the event is called in history, the French and Indian Wars, because that's how it was named at the time. So George Washington ends up leading the British Army, and he becomes a hero during the French and Indian Wars. The British capture the northern part, all right, and we call that Canada, okay? And that happened in 1759. Then the British continued to win until eventually they signed the Treaty of Paris, which was a treaty that was signed in the city of Paris, yes, and that was in 1763, and that marked the end of the war. Basically, Great Britain won. And so France had to cede their land. To cede something means to give it up, not to give like a gift or a present, but to give up because you lost something. So they had to give up their land that they claimed, and they gave it all over to Britain. So all of this stripy, green stripy land that says ceded, all of that is land that the French gave up to the British at the end of the French and Indian Wars. And then additionally, Great Britain got all of this land all the way to the Mississippi. Okay, so they get Canada and all of this land in North America over to the Mississippi River. Okay, now pause there again. Tell me, what was the purpose and the result of the French and Indian Wars? Put that in your notes now. So after the French and Indian War, King George III saw this as an opportunity to kind of assert himself in the colonies. He was a very take charge kind of king. He wanted to control the colonies for his own gain and power. There is evidence that shows he might have actually had some mental illness and might have been a little bit crazy. And so he did some things that made the colonists rather angry. And we're going to see what that first thing is here in just a moment. Plus, check out that wardrobe. I mean, would you want to follow someone who dresses like that? I mean, maybe I would. All right, now pause here again. What are your first impressions of King George? Put that in your notes. So here's the first thing that King George actually did. It was, well, not the very first thing, but one of the things that really angered the colonists in the New World, right, over in North America. It was called the Proclamation of 1763. You see, now that the French and Indian Wars were over, some of the Native Americans that were fighting with the British are now fighting against the British. Furthermore, the Native Americans that were fighting on the side of the French are still there, and they're also fighting against the British. So there's a lot of tension between the Native Americans and the colonists as the colonists are trying to move into the land that they won from the French and Indian War. And so in order to stop the fighting, King George draws this imaginary line through the Appalachian Mountains. You can see it over here. It's this dotted red line in between the orange and the yellow. And that was called the Proclamation of 1763 line. And basically what he said is, it's like that thing when you're fighting with your brother or sister, and so you put a line of tape down the middle of your bedroom and you're like, that's your side, this is my side. That's kind of what King George did to the Native Americans and the colonists. He said, well, Native Americans, you have to stay west of this line, and colonists, you have to stay east of that line. Well, that actually made everyone really upset because, one, the colonists wanted to go into that land. They just fought for that land. They died for that land in the French and Indian War, and so they wanted to go into that land and live there. And of course, the Native Americans were like, you can't tell me what to do. You're not my king. And so they're not really following his orders either. And so the Proclamation of 1763 really just created more tension in the colonies after the French and Indian Wars. And so King George responds in this way. Rather than say, oh, you're right, that is difficult, he decides to expand his army, and he sends more and more soldiers to hold the colonists back and create even more tension against the Native Americans. Nice going, King George. So pause here again and tell me, why was the Proclamation of 1763 not a good solution for the colonists or the Native Americans? So there we go. We talked about some of the status of the early colonies in North America leading up to the Revolution. We're starting to see tension brewing, and things are going to get a little bit dicier coming up in our next few lessons here. So we'll see where things go next.